Water ebbs and flows but has no boundaries. It molds itself to fit any situation. It is shaped only by what contains it. Break the container, and water flows in every direction. Containers for a moment in time, a temporary stasis for what eventually gives way. Our concepts are those containers, useful at times, but easy to mistake for reality itself. I confuse the part for the whole when the container becomes my truth. I divide and conquer with my concepts, and in so doing, I turn the living into the dead. So I must hold my cup lightly. The concept is my tool, but I must be ready to let it go when it's no longer needed. Take, for instance, these paintings by Mark Rothko entitled The Multiforms. Here the saturation of color begins to exceed our concepts. The effusive excess of color not only absorbs our thoughts, it overwhelms them, rendering our knowledge insufficient to the task of comprehending what we see. This is the meaning of the miracle, to behold what is impossible, to see the invisible at the limits of the visible. Such an experience elicits fascination, not so much at the meaning of the multiforms, but fascination at seeing our own limits held out before us. Doubtless one can impose concepts on the multiforms, to render the sublime as mundane by dissecting it, pricing its value, categorizing its style. But as Rothko himself states, whoever makes use of it, mutilates it. He adds, and if you, as you say, are moved only by the color relationships, then you miss the point. Let us hold our concepts lightly, for as Rothko's paintings reveal, truth always saturates the eyes, the nose, the tongue, the ears, and the skin. In this video and the few that follow it, we'll discuss how knowledge is organized and processed in the mind. In many ways, we have already discussed this topic when addressing how mental representations are developed through memory, how they guide attention through top-down processing, and how they are connected to perception in order to recognize objects. As mentioned in the first video of this series, cognition, conoscere, is about knowledge. But what is knowledge? From a cognitive perspective, it is stored information, generally acquired by experience, and it's the basis for all thinking and action. Knowledge can be thought of in various modalities. There is specific knowledge based in concrete experience, such as what I ate earlier today, but, and more importantly for our purposes, there's also general knowledge, or what may be called concepts. Concepts are stored mental representations of abstract categories that allow us to classify and organize our experiences. They can sometimes be called ideas, theories, classes, or schemas. A central question that we'll address here is how the mind uses concepts to classify objects and how different concepts relate to one another. In other words, we're going to go meta here and ask, what is the concept of a concept from a psychological perspective? I do want to distinguish the cognitive understanding of a concept from what may be considered its philosophical understanding. Philosophy deploys logical arguments to establish a claim, and here we might think of concepts and ideas as, in a sense, having their own reality independent of the mind. In other words, the philosophical approach to concepts concerns epistemology, the study of knowledge, and ontology, the study of existence. For cognitive psychology, we're only interested in concepts as they function in our mind, which means that our concepts don't necessarily have to obey the rules of logic, and in fact, they often don't. We can see this clearly when we consider a propositional understanding of concepts, or what may be called a definition. A good definition is one that is both comprehensive and that distinguishes itself from other concepts. One definition of a planet is that it's a celestial body moving in an elliptical orbit around the sun. And to be clear here, a celestial body is an aggregation of matter in the universe that constitutes a unit for astronomical study. So stars, planets, and nebula are all celestial bodies. While a seemingly straightforward definition of planet, many difficulties begin to arise once you start thinking about it. For example, in a binary star system, one star may orbit another. This would technically mean a star is a planet. Asteroids are also celestial objects that orbit the star, and so qualify as planets. In this situation, the definition may be too inclusive, incorporating objects that we wouldn't ordinarily label as planets. At the same time, this definition excludes certain objects that we might call a planet. For example, if a sufficiently massive celestial body came into our solar system, it could potentially disturb the orbits of our current planets to such a degree as to result in one of those planets being ejected from the solar system altogether, and thus no longer orbiting our sun. Such a rogue planet or interstellar planet would no longer meet the criteria of planet. And so the definition of planet is also insufficient because it's not inclusive enough. The lack of sufficient exclusivity and inclusivity requires that there be a better definition of the word planet. Now, for planets, this may seem like a matter of semantics and of little practical importance, but definitions do have major significance for us. For example, definitions of gender, marriage, and hate speech all have fallen under major debate in recent years, and such definitions have a major impact on people's everyday lives. One of the major difficulties with definitions is that the world is made of a lot of fuzzy boundaries in which clear-cut distinctions cannot be made. With many definitions, there are often exceptions. This is especially the case when applying a human-made definition to nature. While nature does potentially contain some clear distinctions, more often than not, boundaries are not clear. What is the distinction between life and death, human and non-human? While some scientific proof could be offered to support one of these distinctions, there remain unresolved exceptions that make such distinctions always tentative and subject to change. An alternative to definitions are thinking about concepts in terms of family resemblances. This is a proposal associated with the philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein. In his work Philosophical Investigations, he writes the following: consider, for example, the proceedings that we call games. I mean board games, card games, ball games, Olympic games, and so on. What's common to all of them? Don't say there must be something common or they wouldn't be called games, but look and see whether there is anything common to all. For if you look at them, you will not see something that is common to all, but similarities, relationships, and a whole series of them at that. I can think of no better expression to characterize these similarities than family resemblances. For the various resemblances between members of a family, build, features, color of eyes, gait, temperament, etc., overlap and crisscross in the same way. Rather than focus on defining features that every member of a category possesses, family resemblances focus on characteristic features found across many but not all members. A dog, for example, probably has 4 legs, probably barks, and probably wags its tail. A creature without these features is unlikely to be classified as a dog, but not every dog has every feature. One way family resemblances may be organized is based around a prototype. A prototype is a composite or idealized member of a category that possesses all the characteristic features but may not be exactly like any particular member. Rather than clear boundaries with a yes or no decision that one finds with a definition, members are related to prototypes through a graded membership, whereby the more closely a member resembles a prototype, the more likely that member is going to be categorized as belonging to that concept. So some dogs are doggier than other dogs. We sometimes express this by doubling the word, like, for example, when we say that a person is not just smart, but smart, suggesting that they are more prototypical of smartness than someone who is just smart. Implicit prototypes can be tested using rating and sentence verification tasks. A rating task may ask participants to rate members of a category from most to least, in this case from more fruity to less fruity, or from more birdy to less birdy. Now, we understand that all of these members are equally fruit and birds, but some fruit and birds are more fruity and birdy than others. At least that's how our mind seems to categorize these members. We can observe something similar using the sentence verification task, in which participants are asked to make judgments about category membership, asking to respond true or false to propositions such as robins are birds and penguins are birds. What is observed with this task is that while participants are correct on the questions themselves, answering true, their response time differs depending upon how close the member is to its prototype. A participant is likely to respond true to the proposition that robins are birds more quickly than the proposition that penguins are birds, because robins are more closely resembling the prototypical bird than do penguins. While family resemblances and prototypes reflect certain advantages over definitions, especially in how the mind categorizes members, they are not necessarily any more free from biases and problematic limitations that plague definitions. For example, your prototypes are likely developed through experience, and as we know, our experiences are shaped by the social cultural context in which we have them. This can lead to very damaging prototypes when we consider who more accurately resembles a criminal or who is more or less human. History and politics are full of examples demonstrating the harm such prototypes can have. As we'll see in a future video, this can also lead us to making very poor decisions. Another way we categorize members are through exemplars, whereby we rely on knowledge of specific category members, exemplars, rather than on general abstract prototypes. Exemplars are more limited than prototypes, but they allow us to incorporate exceptions more easily. For example, when I think of the category of basketball player, I may not primarily rely on a prototype so much as an exemplar, in this case Michael Jordan. And when I classify basketball players as basketball players, it may often be in reference to Jordan. This doesn't mean that I only employ an exemplar, however. I do rely on prototypes as well, such as being tall and athletic. And in fact, I often use both exemplars and prototypes at the same time. When developing concepts in the mind, we often begin with exemplars, and through experience with more and different kinds of members, build up a prototype. My daughter, for example, likely uses her family as an exemplar of what families are. As she gets older and gets exposed to more families, she'll begin to realize that the exemplar of her family is not necessarily reflective of all other families, and so she'll have to gradually build up a wider perspective on this concept. Finally, we've been talking about concepts as if they're discrete categories that don't interact with one another. However, our categorization is not based simply on definitions, family resemblances, prototypes, or exemplars, but also entail a whole set of background assumptions that guide this process. When presented with counterfeit money, despite it looking exactly like legitimate money, you will likely categorize this as not real money. Your categorization is not based on visible features, but rather on your background knowledge of how money works in a society. Similarly, you may categorize a robin and a penguin as both birds, not because they share similar physical features, but because of your understanding of evolution and genetics. In other words, you operate with a set of implicit theories about your concepts that provide the knowledge to guide your decisions of what a thing is. Such theories allow us to draw causal inferences and to think about new possibilities with a category, to help us reason differently about different kinds of categories of objects. If I asked if it was possible to use a screwdriver as a hammer, many of you might be able to imagine the possibility, even though the screwdriver may not be optimally shaped to hammer nails as a hammer would be. However, if I asked if a cat can become a dog, most of you would probably say that that's not possible. The reason for this is that you likely think differently about artificial, human-made concepts like tools than you do natural concepts like animals. You hold implicit theories about these concepts that allow for certain possibilities and not others. Natural objects often contain some sort of essential, stable qualities, generally based on our understanding of genetics. Whereas to recognize tools, we understand them in terms of their functions, and many different kinds of objects can serve those functions. In this video, we've discussed concepts and how the mind uses them to categorize members. This includes the use of definitions, which provide clear boundaries of what belongs inside and outside a concept, but is often not flexible enough to consider exceptions. Family resemblances and prototypes categorize members on a graded membership based on how many typical features are present. Exemplars categorize members based on a particular personal example that one has acquired. When developing a concept, we often begin with exemplars and gradually move toward prototypes as we encounter more and more variations. Finally, we consider concepts as implicit explanatory theories that provide a set of assumptions and background knowledge to guide our judgments and reasoning about category membership. Thank you for watching. Feel free to like this video and leave a comment or question below if you have one. Also, if you want to see more, please subscribe to this channel. I'll see you next time.